Well, UNESCO's World Heritage Committee meeting in Doha has knocked back an Abbott government application to repeal some of the Tasmanian World Heritage areas. Joining us now is Greens leader, Senator Christine Milne, who of course is also a senator for Tasmania. You'd be very happy about this decision.
Oh, look, I'm delighted that the World Heritage Committee has upheld the integrity of the boundaries of the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area. These have been contested for decades. I've been part of the fight for nearly 30 years for these forests. There was great celebration last year when they were included, and so for Australia to go back 12 months later and try to have them taken out, it was just unprecedented, and no wonder Australia was just rejected out of hand.
Well, the Environment Minister Greg Hunt has said in the past that the government would respect the World Heritage Committee's decision. Are you confident that that is the case?
Well, I think that they have to do that. Australia's a signatory to the convention. It was clear from the response of the committee. We had Portugal speak very strongly, saying that that was a feeble effort, unprecedented from the Australian government, rejected also by Colombia and Germany, who spoke against it. I think the Minister has no option but to accept it, and the Prime Minister. And clearly the damage to us, though, is Australia has once again been humiliated on the world stage, trying to do something which everybody finds just vandalism.
Are you disappointed, though, that the same committee didn't place the Great Barrier Reef on the endangered list? It didn't kind of red card the government, it gave it a yellow card, a year's grace, because of course in that year more development could happen on the reef.
Well, the World Heritage Committee sent a mission to examine the damage to the reef and the proposed coal ports, gave the Australian government a clear warning not to proceed. Yes, they've given them an extension of time, but interestingly, Australia worked with some other countries to try and get that even watered down, and the committee didn't stand for it and rejected the efforts to water down what was a pretty weak decision. So let's see. But there's going to be increased focus on Australia and the Great Barrier Reef, and what the Australian government has now done is shown the World Heritage Committee absolutely that it is environmentally irresponsible. And so I think people are really going to get their backs up if Australia continues to undermine the outstanding universal values of our World Heritage areas.
Now, moving on, in the Senate last night, Labor and the Greens combined to insist that legislation covering Infrastructure Australia would mean that Infrastructure Australia has to consider climate change when recommending new projects. Were you somewhat surprised that that wasn't included in the first place?
Well, isn't it amazing that the government would leave out a consideration of climate change and the impacts for Infrastructure Australia? But it just shows you how completely out of touch Tony Abbott and his government actually is. If you just look at there are two ways of looking at it. The first one is the damage already to infrastructure because of extreme weather events. We've had Cyclone Yassi, we've had the Queensland floods, we've had fires all over the country, extreme heat waves which have buckled railway lines, which have melted roads, we've had floods wash away roads right around the country. People have had to spend millions, if not billions, having to restore infrastructure after extreme weather events. So that is a no-brainer. We have to do things, and clearly if we had fixed the levee around Roma, we would not have had the millions that have had to have been spent, not to mention the excessive insurance premiums that now people are faced with that they can't pay. So that's a no-brainer. But the other one is that around the world, capital flows for infrastructure. Australia depends on foreign capital for infrastructure. Increasingly, all of that is under a risk assessment in relation to climate, and that means people are looking at their capital and saying, would I want to sink it in stranded assets? Why would I build a coal port in Queensland or a railway in Queensland to a coal mine when China is moving away from coal? So if we don't include risk analysis on climate, we are going to risk stranded assets, we're going to risk being bypassed by the international capital market, and we're going to risk a country losing infrastructure, destroying areas which we could have anticipated and done something about.
Well, Tony Abbott says that he believes in climate science, that he believes in anthropogenic climate change. Does his actions with this legislation suggest different?
Oh, look, he doesn't. The fact that he can stand up on the global stage and say that climate change is not an economic issue tells you that he just doesn't believe it. He still thinks climate change is crap, clearly. And he thinks that it should be just dealt with over at some other committee, and that the finance ministers, the treasurers, world leaders coming to the G20 ought not to waste their time talking about climate change. That's his view, and he's completely wrong. I mean, everyone from Lord Stern, for goodness sake, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, everyone sees the link, and as we've just discussed, impacts of extreme weather are clearly an economic issue, not to mention investment in renewable energy in the future.